Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Erica Jordan. I'm the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Alumni Relations here at UCI. I wanted to take a moment to welcome you all to our 5th installment of Lunch with Eaters. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to join us. Lunch with Eaters is our twice-a-month virtual lunch and learn. This program is designed for UCI alumni and friends, and we just are happy to have you and have this program today. So a couple of housekeeping items. One, you guys are all muted, but we welcome you to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen or at the top of your screen, depending on your device, for any questions or comments, and we will manage those throughout the program, as well as at the end, we will have a question and answer section. One thing I also want to mention is that at any time, we welcome you to visit our Anteaters Go Virtual webpage. This page has our upcoming virtual programs, different coloring pages, just different ways you can stay connected to the Anteater alumni community. With that, I want to introduce our speaker for the day, Héctor Tobar. Héctor Tobar is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, novelist, and contributing writer for the New York Times. He earned his MFA in fiction from UCI in 1995 and has gone on to have his books land on bestseller lists, be adapted to the big screen, and translated into 15 languages. His new novel, The Last Great Road Bum, will be published by FSG in August. At UCI, he's an associate professor in the Literary Journalism program and Department of Chicano Latino Studies. Another noteworthy award to mention is that Héctor is a proud Laws and Laurels recipient. The Alumni Association's highest honor awarded to UCI community members for their outstanding service. Please join me in giving him a big Anteater welcome. Héctor.
Thank you, Erica. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. It's wonderful to be part of this event. I want to say that I've been an anteater since the 1990s. I went to get my MFA at UC Irvine in 1993 when I had just turned 30, gotten married, and decided to write a novel. And, Irvine has been a place that has always stayed with me. During the years after I got my MFA, I went back to be a newspaper reporter at the LA Times. But I always had this idea that I would return to this creative space, right? This space that had been really important for me in my personal development, a place where I went from being a scribe, a journalist, a daily reporter, to trying to be an artist. When I was getting my MFA at Irvine, we joked that the MFA stood for Mother Frickin' Artist, right? And so that was that was part of what Irvine represented for me, And I think that Irvine has always stayed with us for the years that we've left, after we've left, and it's just so great to be back here talking about writing.
Well, I know we are all super excited to pick up your book as it comes out pretty soon. And congratulations on, the career that you've had to date. One thing we're really excited about is that there is going to be one Anteater that will receive an autographed copy of your book that comes out. And the team used a virtual random drawing pick, and we're proud to announce that Ariana Quijos, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, class of 2012, is our winner. So congratulations to you. We will be mailing out this book as soon as it's published and we get it signed. Congratulations. Okay, so Héctor, I'm going to transition back to you. We look forward to your keynote.
Well, first I want to say thank you to the UCI alumni and to Jessica Fernandez and Annabelle Adams, who have quietly been cajoling me to do this and sending me a steady stream of emails and reminding me of the event and how important the alumni are to our university. Also, I want to say that the book that you're going to receive there in that auction, my novel, The Last Great Road Bum, is a novel about a true story. It's a true story. It's a novel that is based on the life of a real person, Joe Sanderson, who was a Salvadoran rebel in one part of his life, Another part of his life was a blonde, blue-haired, blue-eyed guy from Urbana, Illinois. And so Joe Sanderson left the comforts of Urbana, traveled to El Salvador when he was at 38 or 39, and decided and talked his way into a rebel army. And so this novel really is a hybrid of fiction and nonfiction because it's based on his writings that he left behind. He was someone trying to be a novelist for much of his life, never actually succeeded in publishing a book, but I have 20 years of his writings. And so this work is a hybrid. And to me, that's also appropriate for me in terms of my career, because I have been working in fiction and nonfiction for my entire career. For almost 30 years now as a professional writer. I've written 3 novels and 2 works of nonfiction, in addition to being a reporter. And part of what I want to talk about today is how nonfiction and fiction can teach each other different things about the writing process. And so let me start with my little presentation here, and I will share my screen if you can
Hector,
bear with
before
me.
we start your presentation,
Yes.
a quick poll of the group to see who's interested in writing, creative writing, and then we'll have you jump in there.
Okay. So yes, we have this poll here, which is, do you enjoy the writing process? And the two available answers are yes or no, it's a pain in the ass. And, you know, I mean, I have a really fraught relationship with the writing process. It's basically a big chunk of my life. It's my profession. It's how I have kept my family fed and housed over the years. But at the same time, I know that writing is something that is always, for me, always remains today something that is very difficult to do. I don't get writer's block really, but I get writers just ennui, kind of like the sense of like, oh my God, how am I going to bring myself to write again today? And so I just, that's why we asked that question. And so I see now here that we have 82% actually enjoy the writing process and 18% say it's a pain in the ass.
And then we do have a couple people in the chat who said it needs a third option of all of the above.
Right, both, exactly.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Okay. So yeah, we ask ourselves then, as we begin, why write at all, right? That's a big question. I think it's important to begin there. Why even write? I think that to me, the number one reason is to embrace the spirit of curiosity and ambition that we learned as UCI students. Right? We went to college because we wanted to change the world. We wanted to make something of ourselves, right? Or because we wanted to learn about some subject that really just inspired us and motivated us. And I think that's one of the reasons why we write. And it's important to remember these things as we undertake any kind of creative process. And also we write because writing can create understanding and self-awareness, right? We spend a bunch of time dedicating ourselves to writing a specific project, writing about a specific person, writing about ourselves, writing about something that happened to us. And in the process of doing that, we learn something about ourselves. I had a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where I did my undergraduate work, who used to say, Hector, you don't know anything until you write it down. So the process of writing is this process of reflection, right? And also we write because writing makes us feel powerful. I know that this is true in my case. From a really early age, people told me that I could write well. And I just liked that feeling of people reading the words that I had to write. And when we write, we're playing with language, right? And language is one of those most powerful markers of being human, right? This goes back to Dr. Seuss, right? We're reading Dr. Seuss as kids. We learn how to make words rhyme. We learn words can do crazy and fantastic things. As we get older, we learn the power of mastering vocabulary, of learning words in other languages. And so when we write, we play with language. And this is something that, that makes us feel alive. It makes us feel human, right? So writing is an emotional and an intellectual exercise, right? And so when we sit down to write, the idea is to recreate the feeling of a lived moment. Okay, that's how creative writing works. This is we're talking about creative writing. One of the things that one of the ways that creative writing works on a psychological level is that, and there's been studies that actually have been done that show this, is that when someone reads a novel or a work of nonfiction, a work of history, a biography, the reader experiences that reading as if it were something really happening to them. So the process on the brain is equal to that of a real life event. And we can achieve that, right? That feeling of a lived moment in writing. And that's one of the reasons, that's one of the things that we're trying to do in writing, right? And especially we're trying to find words for experiences that are kind of on the edge of our ability to express them in words. And to me, that is, that's what I do almost every day, is I have a general idea of a mood I'm trying to capture, a sensation I'm trying to capture, but I don't quite have the words. And so sitting down in front of a keyboard or sitting down sometimes with a paper and pen is a process of trying to find words to describe things that have resisted being put into words. So one of the most basic things to remember for me, and I'm going to talk about all different kinds of writing, fiction and nonfiction, fantasy, etc. All kinds of writing, all writing is based on human truth, right? On things that we know are true as people living on earth, you know, as fathers, as mothers, as sons, as lovers, right? As friends. We learn certain truths about life through these roles. And that really is what writing, good writing is based on, is on these truths. So let me be more specific, right? So for example, in fiction can hew really close to reality, okay? You can write a work, I could write a work of fiction that's about a 50-something Guatemalan American professor, right, living with his 3 kids in Los Angeles, and call the guy Larry instead of Hector, but it's really a novel about me, and that's what a romana clef is. It's a novel, a story where it's very, very close to reality, except you've just changed the names. And that's Citizen Kane, for example, is an example of that kind of work, of a romana clef, right? Because it's really about William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate of the early 20th century, but he's named Charles Foster Kane in the film. So fiction can be, you know, close to reality with just the names changed. Or it can be a fantasy, right? That's an allegory. So Star Wars to me is really an allegory about empire and imperialism. And it's really about the changing world of the 1960s and 70s, because let's remember that George Lucas wrote this in the early 70s and late 60s, when, you know, all of these colonial territories are freeing themselves of imperial rule. There's an anti-imperialist war going on in Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, Star Wars is really about this deeper human truth that there are empires and there are conquered people, right? And even a play that seems fantastic, a work that seems fantastic, like, I don't know how many of you have seen the wonderful play by Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot, which takes place in this sort of surreal dream space where these 2 men are sort of trapped in this space. And it seems sort of fantastic and dreamlike, but that really corresponds to a certain way it feels like to be human, to be confused, to be in an existential place, right? So fiction can do things that seem fantastic, but really are based on these human truths, right? So creative nonfiction. I have written a book of creative nonfiction. My previous book before the one that's being published is the story of the Chilean miners who were trapped in 2010, right? This is a book that is nonfiction, but which I wrote as if it were a novel, right? With lots of details of these men and their families, getting inside their point of view. Many of them were suffering from alcoholism before they were trapped. Many of them had emotional breakdowns during the time they were trapped, right? And so my story here attempts to share, right, to recreate these human truths, right, in the work of nonfiction, the human truths that you feel in a novel. Okay, so we have these different kinds of writing that we can do, nonfiction, fiction. How do we get started, right? Well, I think it's very important whenever you set off on any writing project is to begin by thinking small, basic, and intimate, okay? Because in fact, a successful work of creative writing is based on that which is basic, very intimate, right? Something that you can feel, you can almost touch, right? And so let's start writing by thinking of basic, small, intimate moments, right? And so the basic building blocks of fiction and creative nonfiction are different elements in which we tackle something small, basic, and intimate, right? And I've listed here a few of these basic elements of creative writing, which are, you know, all of you may remember from your English classes in high school or UCI: character, setting, voice, and plot. So character. Character is for me the most important thing. My novel, The Tattooed Soldier, is about a killer, okay? A death squad killer from Guatemala, my first novel. And so this protagonist is someone who I invented, but I had to be inside of him. I had to become him, right? He had to want something. This is something important, right? A lot of people, when they first set off to write fiction, they write very passive characters who sort of walk like, you know, as if in a dream through a situation. But real life doesn't really work that way. And so it's important to give good motivations to our characters. Those are the engines of our stories, right? It took me a long time to learn this as a writer. One slide to summarize what it took me years to learn. Setting is also a wonderful place to start. Where and when is the story taking place, right? Does this time and place have a spirit or elan? Okay, so you arrived at UCI in whatever year you arrived. It's, you know, this is now, let's say 10 or 15 years ago or 5 years ago. Did the world feel different 5 years ago? Actually, I can say that definitely true compared to today, because we're living in this, you know, horrible, time of virus and confinement, and, you know, and so, but, you know, trying to sort of capture the mood and feel of a place is something that can be really satisfying in writing, and something that is a good starting point, right? Les Miserables captures, you know, early 19th century post-revolutionary and pre-revolutionary. It's sort of stuck between two revolutions. Paris, right? Paris is a character in the novel, also in the musical, right? So thinking of these basic sort of, what does it feel like to live in Paris in 1840? What does it feel like to be a UCI student, you know, in 2010 or 1995 or whatever, right? That's part of what can get started as writing. Here are some writing prompts. Is there someone you remember or a character that you think you'd like to write about, right? Is there a moment in time when something happened that changed you forever? How about a way you once felt, you know? Maybe how you felt when you first fell in love. You know, all the different emotions that went through you with that particular moment. That is a good sort of, you know, let me, you know, immerse myself in that. I think those are some good prompts to get started. But always remember this as you sit down to actually do it, which is this: specificity. Specificity is what sells a story. The unique details that make a story feel real, right? So you can be writing a total fantasy. You can be writing a you know, sort of Star Wars type novel, right? Or something very as existential like Waiting for Godot. But those little things that you put in that are very specific to the character, specific to the place, that's what creates the illusion of it being real, okay? So specificity helps to create the illusion of the real. And remember that this really is, to me, writing is, it's a magic show, you know? It's sleight of hand. I show you a few little details, and you feel the realness of the story, right? You get immersed in it. And one of my favorite quotes about this is from the great Garcia Marquez. Garcia Marquez says, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Colombian novelist, the late Colombian novelist, Nobel Prize laureate, had been a journalist early in his career. He worked as a reporter on a local beat in a Colombian newspaper. And so someone asked him, well, how is journalism like writing a novel? And he said, well, journalism really taught me a lot about how to write a novel, because there's those little details, that really sell a story. So he said in this one quote, it's in the Paris Review, if you want to look it up, Garcia Marquez's interview with the Paris Review many years ago. If you say that there are elephants flying in the sky, people are not going to believe you. But if you say that there are 425 elephants flying in the sky, people will probably believe you, okay? So that little detail saying there's 425 elephants, or even better, I saw elephants flying in the sky and they were so low, I could see the saliva dripping from their mouths, right? Something like that. That little detail sells the story, okay? So, that's really what's gonna make our story satisfying and successful. Write what you know. Now, a lot of times fiction writers are told, write what you know. This is something that many of you I know have heard. Because that's for a reason, and it's because good writing comes from knowing the details of the world, right? You're going to recreate your UCI dorm. You lived in that dorm for 2 years. You know it like the back of your hand, right? But it doesn't mean that that's all you have to write. I like to say that in addition to write what you know what you write, okay? Because writing nonfiction taught me this, that I can explore the lives of other people and enter those lives by doing research, by doing interviews, right? And that it's possible for me as a writer to learn about other people's lives and to create those lives on the page, right? But it does require a real deep commitment. You have to be deeply committed to do the work required to enter the world of other people, okay? And that's basically where a lot of my life has been swallowed up by researching the lives of other people very often, whether it be the miners that I wrote about, Joe Sanderson, my last novel. I researched the Guatemalan military to write my first novel, a little bit more about that later. So know what you write. You can learn other things, write about other things. Applying fiction principles to nonfiction. So I've written novels, and I've learned from writing novels how to make my nonfiction more believable. And I think it's one thing is that emotional complexity makes nonfiction more believable, right? So what I'm saying is that, for example, in journalism, we want to write about, immigrants, say. We want to say just good things about immigrants because immigrants are getting attacked. So we write about immigrants being victimized, etc. But that's not a real full portrait of what an immigrant man, woman is, right? So if in writing creatively, I can embrace the flaws of the people I write about, right? The great father who also drinks too much a little bit sometimes, right? The great mom who works so hard for her kids, but also is a little bit self-centered sometimes. Those elements of complexity make a character more believable. So whenever you're creating a character, look for that kind of complexity. Applying fiction to nonfiction. Now, this is a picture again of my Chilean miners who I wrote about. They taught me a lot of lessons. And, the one important thing was not to see the people I'm writing about as a type, right? So they weren't just victims of a mining disaster. They were also just real human beings who happened to get trapped. And so it's very important for me as a writer to see the whole person, right? Not just the immigrant trapped in detention, not just the miner trapped in a mine, but the man who fell in love, or the man who was ambitious. He worked, wanted to make extra money and got himself trapped in the mine because he was trying to make extra money, right? And so when you try to see the whole person, you discover emotional truths that resonate with the reader. I'm writing a lot about my father now. My father is in his 70s. And the more and more I see the complexity in him, his flaws, the more powerful I think he becomes as a character on the page. Unfortunately, he doesn't quite see it that way, but that's another story. So if you, this is something that, I tell my journalism students here at UCI. I teach in the literary journalism department. And, that you can go and do research. If you're writing a work of fiction, you can use the research methods that you use in literary journalism. You can apply those to creating fiction, right? You can go scout locations. This is a picture of a building that is a tenement in the Pico Union district of central Los Angeles, which I also use to be the setting of one of the settings in my novel, The Tattooed Soldier. So I wanted to describe this sort of tenement where one of the characters lived. I actually went to some tenements, walked around, snuck in sometimes, right? Because when you do that, you are literally walking in a place, a lived place. And then when you sit down to write, you create this illusion that you're walking through this world that's real, okay? And so research and interviews can also really help in that process. It's all giving yourself the confidence, right, to make you believe that what you're writing is real. So when you sit down to write creatively and let's say you're going to create, a place in the 19th century, or you're going to recreate the UCI that you knew circa 2001. Well, you're going to have done so much work to immerse yourself in that place that it's going to feel really real to you, which is going to give you confidence in creating that place. Now, part of what I like to also advise my students to do, and advise all writers, who, especially those who are thinking about writing about something related to their personal experience, is to do something called what I call memory work, which is where you work your way into a memory. You live inside the memory. You give yourself time to live inside a memory. And so what I mean by that is that you start writing, let's say I'm going to remember, a day in 1993, the day I decided to get my MFA. And I'm trying to reconstruct that day in 1993. And I write a couple of sentences of things I remember. Once I write those 2 sentences down, that's like it's like a snowball that you're going to roll down a hill. And as the snowball rolls down the snowy hill, it's going to get bigger and bigger, right? Because what happens is when you start to write a couple of sentences and you leave it, you put it aside for a second, that stays in your brain. And later you might be washing the dishes, and this has happened to me over and over again in my lifetime. I'm writing in the morning, I go in the afternoon to wash my dishes. I remember those 2 or 3 sentences that I wrote in the morning, and I add something to it, okay? And so this memory work becomes almost like a lifestyle of mine for the time that I'm writing a book or a piece, right? So do memory work, live inside what you're writing. And also, part of what we're trying to do is create unique language and voice, a very specific language and voice, right? And so we want, I'm sorry, I think I might've gone back. So we want, whoops, there we go. So we want language and voice. We want, when I say that, we want not just big words, but also be attuned, your ear open to slangs and idioms. My students love it when I tell them this, because what I'm telling them basically is I want you to feel free to talk like a young person when you write for me. I want to feel the slang of the communities that you're from, okay? Because that richness is going to make this story come alive, okay? Also, we're hunting for specific nouns and adjectives, right? And I'll talk about that in a second. Accents and idiolects. Idiolect is the way a specific person speaks. My idiolect is a mixture of Chicano English of the East Side and a little bit of the white boy surfer English that I knew from Whittier when I lived there for high school, mixed with a little bit of like maybe Mexico City kind of attitude. That's my specific way of talking, right? So we want to be attuned to those kinds of things in individual people. So you can actually, you can actually go on a vocabulary hunt, is what I like to say. In my first novel, I went, I went into the UCI library and found an old Quiché dictionary, which I used because one of my characters was Mayan Indian. And I found these words that are in my novel, like Balam meets jaguar. Driving around LA, I look at plants and I want to learn the names of them. And so many years ago, I learned that those trees that bloom purple in LA are called jacarandas, right? So we're always going to be on these vocabulary hunts. So working for me, working between nonfiction and fiction, I think I learned to always approach a story with an open mind and curiosity. Having an open mind, being curious are really great qualities for any writer to have. And that's going to be the essence of the work you do, is going to be based on having an open mind, not being judgmental to your characters. That's really important. I think being judgmental is the enemy of creative writing. If you're trying to impose a value judgment on the decisions that people make rather than seeing them as human beings, then it makes very flat, very stilted writing. So being really open-minded and curious is a key thing that I've learned to apply to my fiction writing, because I was a reporter, see, and I learned to go to new places, right? I learned to I never knew South Central Los Angeles before I became a reporter. I went to South Central, to Watts over and over again. And I learned about these places. I learned that there are other realities, right, in the city of Los Angeles. Also, I think as I've gotten older and done many interviews, I've learned how to enter new emotional spaces, right? And I think that's part of what's satisfying about writing, is that it's this whole emotional education that we give ourselves, okay? Very often when I've started a book, the character I created the first time I sit down to write is extremely different from the character I'm, with 2 or 3 years later when I finish the book. And so these are different things that I've learned from being a reporter that I've brought to being a fiction writer. And of course, interviewing. Interviewing is a wonderful tool, no matter, almost with anything that you write, especially if you're writing something that's very personal, if there are other people in your family who have lived some of the experience you've lived. Interviewing parents or grandparents, siblings, even siblings, is something that I think can be really fruitful in terms of your knowledge of the subject you're going to write about, and also in terms of entering these different emotional spaces. So I'd like to give my students, and I'll give to you here, some tips on interviewing. Let's say you're going to do a memoir about your time as a scientist or something, and you're going to interview other fellow scientists. Well, I want you to go to that interview thinking like a writer, which means that you're going to be on the alert, right, for dramatic details, right? And you're going to use your imagination when you interview. So if someone starts telling you a story about some dramatic thing that happened in the lab, you pause for a moment, you ask them, wait a second, where was this lab? Or, what time of day was it? Or do you remember exactly what that test tube looked like? What kind of test tube was it? Or whatever, right? So you have to be ready to think on your feet, right? And also, sometimes you're interviewing somebody and they're telling you something that happened in a long way away or a long time ago. Well, it's part of your job to imagine yourself in that place as they're talking to you. So, what I'm saying is essentially be prepared to go to unexpected places in an interview. That's the whole point of an interview, is to be surprised. So don't read from a list of questions. I hate it when people read from a list of questions when they're interviewing me, because it's basically saying they already know what I have to say, which kind of bugs me. And so think of an interview as a conversation between people. So if you do an interview for the writing thing that you want to write, think of it as a conversation, not as a mining process where you're taking something. It's really not unsatisfying to be interviewed by someone who you can tell is trying to get something that they need. It's much better to have this conversation. And that also means that sometimes in an interview, you have to give a little to get something back. So, very often I've interviewed survivors of trauma, the miners who were trapped, in Chile, people in Iraq who had suffered through the war there. And so whenever that happens, at the appropriate moment, especially if someone is suddenly, I could see that they're a little bit broken in the interview, where they're sort of suffering, I will share my suffering. I say, I can understand what you're saying. I went to Iraq, I came back, I had 3 months of nightmares from being in that war zone. I've been through that. I have been through therapy. Those little moments where you can make a human connection and share something, really important. And it's something that is part of this process too, of entering the world of the person that you're writing about. Now, so when I've gone back to write nonfiction, the crazy madman who decided to write a novel, the other Hector, he taught me lessons about writing that I then apply to my journalism and nonfiction. And one of the most important things is to push the language, right? So when you write a novel, writing like a badass is basically the point of it, right? The point of it is to write like a badass. And so I try to, to put that principle into writing my nonfiction. Let me push the language, aim for a bit of virtuosity in every paragraph. We're creating art here. Part of the point is to show how much you have worked at mastering language. I think everyone listening to this is a strong writer already. You had to write your way into UCI. You've had to do writing throughout your life. You have worked at it, and so and if you continue to work at it, you will push yourself. Fight for every sentence. Every sentence for me has to have power and meaning behind it. Okay, so those are ways that that fiction has sort of shaped my way of thinking about writing. Patience. The most important thing to have, I think, in writing is to have patience. Oops, sorry, I got a little impatient there. I went to the next slide. Patience. So, it's a very slow process, writing, for me. Good writing is a slow process. Yes, there are times when we have deadlines, but in creative writing, generally speaking, it's a very open-ended process. So, the most important thing to remember is you don't have to write the whole thing at once, right? Tackle it one paragraph or one page at a time, right? Because part of what you're doing is you're teaching yourself a new way to write every time you sit down to write. Now, this is true for me, and I'm now on my 6th book. I've written 5 books. Each book was so different from the one before that I was teaching myself a new way of writing every time I sat down to write. So, I've never written from a woman's perspective before. I've never written from the perspective of a white man, at least not for 300 pages. How do I teach myself how to think differently, right? So be patient with yourself, because it's a slow process. Remember that the average literary novel, for example, is 100,000 words long. Okay, I'm not saying that you might be thinking about writing a book, but this is just to give you an example in terms of of how professional writers approach their work, right? So I usually write the equivalent of 2 drafts to write 1 good draft. So that means if I turn in a book that's 100,000 words long, to write those 100,000 words, I've actually written 200,000 words, because there's another 100,000 that I threw away. That's the way I write it, and it's the way a lot of people write. So on average, I write 2 or 3 hours a day. I don't know anybody who writes creatively who writes more than 3 hours a day. On a rare occasion, maybe 4 or 5 or 6 hours a day. But usually, and for me now, oftentimes an hour is a good writing day for me. So 200 to 300 words a day, 300 words a year, that's about 75,000 words a year. Okay. So that's, so after 2 years, you've written 150,000 words. And so, you think it's almost like geologic time. I know all of us, we live and we work in corporate worlds, in institutional worlds, where time is measured 5 o'clock. I need it by 3, I need it by tomorrow, I need it by the weekend. Well, when you're writing creatively, you're more in the geological time, right? So, as an example here, I'll just give some examples. My novel, The Tattooed Soldier, took me 2 years. I published it 5 years after I started. Translation Nation, my second book, took me 3 years to write. The Barbarian Nurseries took me 7 years to write, with a lot of interruptions, and I published it 16 years after I started it. Long story about that one. My book about Chilean miners was one of the fastest books I've ever written. I wrote it in 3 years, but that's because these crazy miners were waiting for it to come out, and I was afraid they were going to sort of spill the beans and all the secrets that they had. So I rushed to write it like in 2.5 years, and it appeared 3 years after I started it. My last novel, The Last Great Road Bum, I sort of calculate that I worked on it for 6 years, but I actually started it 12 years ago. So life is crazy when you're a writer. Be patient with yourself. And finally, the most important thing I can tell you is to read for inspiration. Read like crazy, which I think you learned at UCI, obviously. But take up again that idea, that notion, right, of reading as brain food. So these are some of my favorite books here. This is my last slide, by the way, and I'll be getting off. When I started off writing fiction, I read every year Best American Short Stories. And it was really wonderful because it was an introduction to sort of literary fiction and how it works. Love it every year it comes out. I was honored to be in 2016 in Best American Short Story. So sorry, a little bit of vanity and narcissism there, but I am in Best American Short Stories 2016. And recently, some of my favorite books have been, for example, Roberto Bolaño's novel 2666, where he's doing all sorts of just incredible high wire acts in terms of the writing. Susan Orlean's nonfiction book, The Orchid Thief, one of my favorite books of all time, so funny, an entry into the world of people who steal orchids for a living. And of course, Truman Capote, sorry, it's a little small there, probably, In Cold Blood. That's what that book is, In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. Amazing work of nonfiction that's just like a novel. So those are my sort of notes on writing. That's essentially a year course, 10-week course at UCI, condensed down into 30 minutes. So thank you for listening, and thank you for your interest.
Thank you, Hector. That was so awesome. I'm not a writer, but I'm kind of like, well, maybe I'll give it a little shot. Couple of hours a week, maybe I'll have a book in 10 years. We do have some really good questions that have come in. So the first question is, how do you separate yourself from the character in a fictional novel who's based on yourself? How can you disconnect from that character and give it create a flow that it needs to bloom?
Wow, yeah, I think that that's a really difficult process. I think that you have to be a little bit ruthless with your characters. I start off with, for every character that I've written, I think has a little bit of myself in it. So Guillermo Longoria, the death squad soldier from Guatemala, who's in my first novel, I gave him my ambition and my impatience with, he's a little bit of a snob. His impatience with the rest of the world is my impatience. But then after a while, they sort of start to go off in their own direction, and I think that you just give them little bits of yourself. I think that's the most important way to think about it, because they have to have integrity as their own people. Many of my characters are really kind of like 2 or 3 characters sort of squeezed together, 2 or 3 people that I knew squeezed together. And you have to just sort of stick with them and definitely just work so much with them, think so much of their backstory that they eventually become somebody else. So with Longoria, I imagined him having this training that happened at a US Army base. I never was trained in an Army base. But once I started to do that, he became his own character. So I started off with something very, very close to me, but just with spending time with the person, with the character, they become somebody else.
Awesome. The next question, Stephanie Osborne asks, she says, hi, Hector. I usually write when I'm in a strong emotional state, but right now in the state of the world, in my personal life, I cannot bring myself to read or write. How do I spark back without casting away my emotions, trauma, or writing empty words?
Right. Well, I think that you have to remember that you're basically 2 different people when you write. You're that person, Stephanie, that you're describing right now, very emotional, just sort of like feeling all these things at once. And I think it's really important when you're in that state to write words in a journal. Think of it as play. Think of it as venting, okay? And vent, give me that person, give me those emotions. That's essential. That's like this really, really powerful force. Then later, you set it aside, and then later, the editor in you, the person who's a little bit more anal, the person who's more calm and rational, that person is going to go back and look and say, whoa, this is a little bit crazy. This needs work. So that both of those people need to work together. The rational person is uninteresting, right? Well, I'm exaggerating. The rational person isn't as interesting, isn't as emotional as that person who's venting, the person who's crying, the person who's upset. So you need to have those two people work together, and that's where patience and time come in. Setting something aside, revising it, going back, you know. I think but it's very, very important to hold on. Taking notes, writing things down, having a journal is a really essential part of the process.
Awesome. So to that point, Farnaz asked, do you edit as you go, or do you wait till your work is finished to do your final editing?
Wow, that's a great question. You know, I think every day is different. There are days when what I'm doing is creating new stuff. And so I'm going to, you know, write a paragraph and like just, you know, try to write. I know it's rough. And there are other days that I go and as I'm writing, I go back and think, I can't go any further because the last 20 pages I wrote suck. So I have to go back and work on that stuff because I don't feel confident. And so I'm actually always doing both. I'm sort of writing forward, moving towards a destination, and then every once in a while I stop and become an editor and revise. So I'm sort of like making a little bit of progress this way and then going back and then making more progress and then going back a little and finally making more progress. So that's you know, I'm doing both at the same time. Yeah.
Got it. Well, we have a couple of questions about publishing, so I'm going to combine them. Do you have any trade secrets about publishing in the publishing industry and about getting your first book published? And also, what about paying to publish your work?
I wouldn't pay to publish my work, and I never paid to publish my work because I think it misses a key part of the process, which is the part of the process where you put your work into the world in which other professionals deal with it and give you feedback and edit you if you're lucky, right? And I think that part of the process is really essential. I think to me, self-publishing would be like trying to walk across a high wire between two buildings without anybody to help you, you know, and it just seems, you know, you could pull it off, but it seems really dangerous. So what I would counsel is there's many different ways that you can enter into the culture of writing. I started, well, first of all, I became a newspaper reporter, but that to me wasn't what creative writing. I wanted to do creative writing. So at night, I took night school classes at, you know, UCLA Extension. I'm sure UCI Extension also offers extension classes, where I sat and I wrote creative pieces, you know, for a professor and shared them with other students. That was an important first step for me. Later, I went to get an MFA, a master's in creative writing, but you don't have to do that. You can also apply for writing conferences. There's a great one, the Squaw Valley Community of Writers. And there's actually literally dozens and hundreds of them across the country where you submit a sample of writing and you sign up for a workshop. You get a professor, a teacher, instructor who's a professional writer, and you get to work with a whole bunch of other people who are also trying to be creative writers. And so that is like an introduction to this community of readers and editors. And you can learn a lot about the process of writing and getting published through that. Your professors would be like a source of like how to find agents, that kind of thing. So I think it's really important to enter into these writing subcultures that exist.
Awesome. This is a little bit different of a question. What is your take on the American Dirt controversy? How critical is it for a writer to be of the same ethnicity as the fictional characters that they are creating?
Yeah, I have only read portions of American Dirt, and I think essentially it's a mystery story masquerading as a literary novel. And so this particular publishing house bought this book because they saw it as something they could market as a great epic immigrant story, not realizing that they were insulting, you know, almost every Latino writer who's tried to write that novel and actually has written that novel and had it published. That they were insulting all of us because they give this woman $1 million, you know, when none of us have ever gotten more than $100,000 for our novels, or, you know, if we're lucky, right? And so I think that part of the fiasco of that novel was that there was nobody to backread that who was Latino. Nobody involved in the process because there are very few Latino people in publishing. Having said that, I think it's extremely important for us to write across lines of ethnicity and gender and not just stick to what we know. And that's part of what my lecture was about. But I think that when you do that, you have to be extremely respectful and serious as an artist. I just finished writing a novel about a white guy who later, fights with the Salvadoran rebels. And so half the novel is very Salvadoran, half the novel is very waspy. I really worked hard at creating this waspy character. And I thought it was a really valuable thing for me to do as a writer. I think it's extremely important for us to open our imaginations, but also to be respectful and to also be, aware of the power relationships. White authors have more power in publishing than non-white authors do. And I think that's something that the people who were involved in American Dirt weren't aware of.
Awesome. Well, we're running out of time. I'm going to ask you two questions that you can answer at once. There are people asking about your journey, the patience and necessary mind frame in finding an agent, and then how did you go about doing that? And then what kind of resources do you use, psyche, personality, of any character in a novel?
Okay, I think I'll take the second one first. I think that entering into emotional spaces is really, really difficult. I think that that's what requires the most patience, like trying to enter into the psyche of the character in my last novel, the one that's coming out in August, the Last Great Road Bum. That was really hard. I mean, he lived in the 1960s and 70s. He was sort of a privileged guy, who traveled to some really dangerous places. I just, once again, trying to find moments in my own life when I felt a little bit like he felt, and then maybe turning up the volume on those moments, that's part of it. Also, just trying to be aware of my blind spots. There's a lot of women in this novel that I wrote. Some of them, one is Joe's mother, the other is his girlfriends. Every once in a while, the testosterone in my body lowers enough that I can sort of see things differently, And it's like, oh yeah, he was a real dick, wasn't he? Like, oh my God, that's what she would have thought. She would have thought this, that, and the other about him, right? And just sort of, that's one of the wonderful things too about being a writer, is that with age comes wisdom. And so age tends to make you a better writer. It's not like being a ballerina, okay? It's not like being an Olympic gymnast. Writing really is something where all the passing of the years, the knowledge that you obtain about family relationships, about interpersonal relationships, that really is very useful. And so for me, getting older has been what's allowed me to enter into some of these different, psychological states. Now, as to the process of getting an agent and all that myself, well, my thing was I went to UC Irvine and I got my MFA and I met a whole bunch of published writers there. I got my agent, the late Virginia Barber, through the UCI program because UCI sent me to Squaw Valley and my manuscript went there. Virginia Barber saw my manuscript and decided to represent, asked if I was interested in her representing me, which of course I was. And so, you just have, you have to pay your dues sometimes. You have to, write a few pieces, have them published, find places to publish your pieces, and someone will notice, publish something in an online journal. And then when you've had that published and it's got a good reception, show that to an agent. And that's, I think, the way you get started.
Awesome. Well, this has been such a rich conversation, Hector. I thank you so much on behalf of myself, the Alumni Association, as well as everyone who attended. Everyone who's on the call, just so you know, we will be sending Hector the questions that we could not answer during our window of time, and we'll do our very best to get those answered during the thank you email. The thank you email will also include a link to the recording of this presentation, and you receive that in about a week. But Hector, thank you so much. We hope we can bring you back again soon. I think we had a great turnout and lots more questions to be had. As I'm wrapping up, you guys will all be receiving a quick poll that's going to pop up just from quick feedback. We appreciate that from you all. And just to make a quick announcement, we have our next Lunch with Eaters will be Friday, July 24th from 12 to 1, and we'll be featuring global artist Julia Gash. If you have any other questions or thoughts, ideas for new programming, please email alumni@uci.edu. And I appreciate everyone who joined us today. We really appreciate your participation. And Hector, is any closing words you have for the group before we
I just think writing is a beautiful thing, very empowering. It's a wonderful lifestyle. It's enriched my life in so many ways. And I'm just so grateful to UCI for its role in making me into a writer. So thank you, Anteaters and the Anteater Nation that has helped to make me into a writer. So thank you.
All right. Well, zat. Everyone have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.